Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session in our series called Between the Testaments. This week, we focus on the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries in the history that bridges the gap between the Old Testament era and the time of Jesus. These scrolls provide us with invaluable insights into how the scriptures were preserved over time, the diversity of Jewish thought in the Second Temple period, and the cultural context that shaped early Christianity. Before we jump into the details, let's remind ourselves of where we are in our study. We're looking at the 4 centuries between the close of the Hebrew Scriptures and the birth of Jesus, what we Christians call the intertestamental period between our Old Testament and our New Testament. In the Jewish world, this period roughly coincides with the Second Temple period. Last week we observed that beginning sometime in the 3rd century before the birth of Jesus, 2 groups of scholars were making important contributions to the development of the Hebrew Scriptures. Starting in Alexandria, Egypt, one group of scholars was translating the Scriptures into the Greek language so that it could be read and understood by a growing number of exiles across the empire established earlier by Alexander the Great. We call this collection of Greek translations the Septuagint, and we summarized their efforts in our last session. In this session, we'll look at the work of another group of Jewish scholars working about the same time to preserve the ancient texts used in their native homeland of Judea. We refer to their collective effort as the Dead Sea Scrolls. So let's jump into this fascinating topic and ask the question, what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? The phrase Dead Sea Scrolls refers to a collection of some 972 documents found in 12 caves in and around what we now know as the Dead Sea in southern Israel. This area is often referred to as Qumran because of the Wadi Qumran, a dry riverbed located nearby. These 12 caves dotted the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, about 13 miles southeast of Jerusalem, in the Judean desert, a harsh, isolated area perfect for a separatist community. About 90% of the documents were found in what is known as Cave 4, as shown in this slide. A 12th cave was identified as recently as 2017. However, it had apparently already been looted because it only contained a single piece of blank parchment. The collection of documents found in these caves include copies of scriptures, copies of Second Temple texts like the Deuterocanonical works we discussed last week, and other works like Enoch, Jubilees, etc. And we also find copies of community documents like the Community Rule and War Scroll. Among these documents, we find manuscripts written in 5 different languages: Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, Latin, and even Arabic. We have then a wonderful wealth of material here to sift through. But who produced all these documents, and why are they all stored in caves? To answer these questions, we need to look more closely at the community that lived in this area during the period. Most researchers believe the scrolls were produced by a Jewish community living at Qumran near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. This community seems to have been most active between the middle of the 2nd century before Christ up until the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived just after the time of Jesus, describes a sect called the Essenes who lived communally, shared property, practiced ritual purity, devoted themselves to copying sacred texts, and were both highly disciplined and separatist. The lifestyle described by Josephus closely matches what we find in the scrolls themselves, especially texts like the Community Rule that we mentioned earlier. Much of the evidence taken from the area would suggest that the Essenes, or at least a group very much like them, were responsible for much of the work in this region. For example, a long room containing low plastered benches or tables, and inkwells, some with remnants of ink. Some researchers regard this room as a dedicated space for scribes copying and repairing scrolls, evidence of intensive scribal activity, though others debate whether it truly was a scriptorium or a more general purpose hall. The scrolls reflect a highly structured priestly separatist community. For example, rules include provisions for multi-year probation, communal councils, property renunciation, and strict discipline for infractions, including expulsion. Rank within the community was based on recognized purity and knowledge. Theology in the scrolls, especially regarding things like the priesthood and messianic expectations, aligns with what ancient writers say about the Essenes. And the site was destroyed by the Romans in AD 68 during the Jewish revolt, the same period when the scrolls were hidden. In any case, whether or not we identify this community as the Essenes, various archaeological finds from Qumran nevertheless reveal an intensely devoted group of followers. For example, excavations revealed at least 10 to 15 stepped plastered mikvot, or ritual baths from across the site, more than typical for a small settlement, indicating an intense emphasis on frequent ritual purification beyond the standard Jewish practice, likely tied to priestly ideals and preparation for holiness, as the community viewed itself as a spiritual temple substitute. A main cemetery south of the buildings has also been uncovered. It contains around 1,100 tombs, mostly oriented north-south, which is unusual for Jewish burials, which typically faced east-west. The tombs contain predominantly male skeletons, though some female and child graves exist in extension areas. This supports the notion that this was a largely male, possibly celibate or ascetic group, though debates continue regarding whether celibacy was universal or phased. The ruins include a large room, often called the refectory, with a pantry holding over 1,000 ceramic vessels. This suggests shared meals in a highly regulated manner, aligning with Essene communal practices. Researchers have also found animal bones, some kosher, buried outside the room, which indicate occasional meat consumption, possibly during festivals. Researchers have also discovered pottery kilns, grain mills, date palm processing areas, and water systems, cisterns and channels from nearby springs, indicating economic independence through agriculture, crafts, and trade. This suggests a contrast with pure asceticism, allowing room for practical support of their isolated lifestyle. Documents from the site reveal that, unlike the lunar and solar calendar of mainstream Judaism used in the Jerusalem temple, this community followed a fixed 364-day solar calendar. The calendar divided the year into perfect quarters with festivals always on the same weekdays. For example, Shavuot, which we know as the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, always occurred on a Sunday. This constituted a major break from the main temple calendar, which the Qumran community viewed as corrupt. Regarding priestly authority, scrolls emphasize Zadokite priests, descendants of the biblical high priest Zadok. They also articulate a type of apocalyptic dualism, described often as the sons of light versus the sons of darkness. And among the documents, we find multiple messianic figures, priestly and kingly, which betrays an ongoing rejection of the current Hasmonean priesthood, along with clear hopes for an end times restoration. We have this highly structured community to thank for their careful preservation of the scrolls that helped to define it. And they remain faithful in this commitment even as the Roman army advanced to crush all opposition, in the first Jewish revolt from AD 66 to 73. When the destruction of their community seemed certain, they acted to protect their work for future generations. They placed their scrolls in clay jars and hid them in nearby caves. Thankfully, the dry desert climate near the Dead Sea then preserved these scrolls for nearly 2,000 years until their discovery in 1947. This region, with its arid climate, was perfect for preserving leather and papyrus. The low humidity and stable temperatures allowed the documents to survive for more than 2 millennia. Looking back, it's astonishing to think that these valuable documents remained hidden for all that time, just waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Little did those early devout worshippers realize how well they had done their job. It would take many generations before their treasures could be discovered again. Eventually, however, God allowed their secrets to be discovered, and now we must turn to that exciting part of the story. In Harold P. Scanlon's book on the scrolls, he includes this interesting statement. Secret agents using assumed names, clandestine meetings under cover of night behind enemy lines, switching cabs to avoid being followed. These sound like things in a spy novel, but they all happened in conjunction with the discovery, sale, and publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This quote captures the dramatic, almost thriller-like story of the scrolls' discovery. Amid the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, dealings involved smugglers, scholars, and spies. It humanizes the discovery, showing how God's providence worked through chaotic human events. The initial discovery occurred between late 1946 and early 1947. Often pinpointed to November 1946 through February of 1947. Muhammad el-Deeb, nicknamed the Wolf, was a teenage Bedouin from the Tamira tribe searching for a lost goat or sheep with his cousin Juma Muhammad and Khalil Musa. He threw a stone into what became known as Cave 1, hearing pottery shatter. And it turns out the jars held the 7 best preserved scrolls from that cave, including the complete Isaiah scroll. The shepherds initially hung some scrolls from a tent pole while deciding what to do, and one, the community rules scroll, was even split in 2 during the hymn. Originally, the Bedouins tried selling the scrolls to a dealer in Bethlehem, but he returned them as potentially worthless or stolen. A Syrian Christian briefly offered to buy them, but then a sheikh suggested a Syrian Orthodox cobbler and part-time antiquities dealer known as Kando. Kando bought some of them and sent the Bedouins back for more, eventually acquiring 7 scrolls total from what became known as Cave 1. Eliezer Sukenik, an Israeli archaeologist and professor at Hebrew University, was one of the first to recognize the scroll's antiquity. And in 1947, he purchased 3 of the scrolls from Kando, the War Scroll, the Thanksgiving Scroll, and a scroll of Isaiah. He later describes his first look at one of the scrolls. My hands shook as I started to unwrap one of them. I read a few sentences. It was written in beautiful biblical Hebrew. The language was like that of the Psalms, but the text was unknown to me. I looked, and I suddenly had the feeling that I was privileged by destiny to gaze upon a Hebrew scroll which had not been read for more than 2,000 years. Upon his death, Sukenik willed the scrolls to his son Yagal Yadin, who would continue to be an important part of the story. In the meantime, Athanasius Yeshua Samuel, metropolitan and head of the Syrian Orthodox monastery of St. Mark, was able to purchase the remaining 4 scrolls from Kandor. 3 of them were photographed by John Trevor in February of 1948 at the monastery. Amid escalating 1948 Arab-Israeli war violence, Samuel smuggled them into the USA, hidden in a suitcase or something similar. He kept them in a Syrian church in New Jersey and eventually attempted to sell them in New York. His 1954 Wall Street Journal ad under miscellaneous items for sale read, "Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. This would be an ideal gift for an educational or religious institution by an individual or group." Then, providentially it seems, Yadin was lecturing in the US and he negotiated anonymously through a middleman, banker Sidney Esteridge, to secure these 4 scrolls for Israel at a cost of $250,000. However, much of that amount went to US taxes due to improper paperwork. In any case, through this astonishing set of circumstances, through the work of Yadin and his father, the original 7 scrolls were united again in one place. They are currently preserved in the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. From this discovery of the first 7 scrolls, the path forward to further discovery was both long and arduous. From 1949 to 1956, a mixture of Bedouin treasure hunters continued to search for new caves, while French and British teams worked to professionally excavate the site. Eventually, they discovered 10 more caves, recovering tens of thousands of fragments from over 900 manuscripts. Cave 4, near the Qumran ruins, produced the largest haul, around 400 to 500 manuscripts in fragments, often in poor condition due to looting and other factors. As these discoveries continued, more researchers requested access to the uncovered documents. For decades, a small international team, led initially by Roland DeVoe, controlled their publication. By the early 1980s, however, academic researchers from various countries were voicing accusations of monopolization and delays, pointing out that some fragments remained unpublished for more than 40 years. Critics like Morton Smith and David Noel Friedman called it disgraceful and outrageous. Pressure continued to mount until at last in 1991, Huntington Library boldly released some unauthorized microfilms and facsimiles of some of the documents. These collective protests eventually forced a concerted publication effort. By 1992, the Israel Antiquities Authority expanded the editorial team to over 50 international scholars, and publication was eventually achieved. By 2001, a majority of official editions were publicly available, and by 2009, Oxford published its Discoveries in the Judean Desert series in 40-plus volumes. Currently, published versions of the documents are even available online at deadseascrolls.org. Looking back on this extraordinary story of discovery, I'm amazed at several levels. On one level, I'm filled with questions. Why, for example, would God have allowed these documents to remain hidden for so long? Why would 1947 be the year in which he allowed their rediscovery? Mostly, however, I am filled with gratitude. Thankful that God moved devout followers to preserve his word, and thankful that I'm here to experience the blessing of their work. So let's take a look at some of the treasures that you and I are blessed to receive among these ancient scrolls. It would be impossible in this brief overview to do justice to the wealth of information included in this extraordinary collection known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. However, we can attempt to provide a brief glance at some of the most celebrated finds. We have, for example, found among these scrolls one of the oldest known copies of the book of Genesis, containing a description of the first 3 days of creation. It's written on parchment in Hebrew and dated sometime between 100 and 1 BC. We also have a copy of the book of Leviticus, written in the ancient Hebrew script used in First Temple times. The fragment, dated somewhere between 1 and 50 AD, deals with the prohibition against the ancient cultic practice of sacrificing children to the Semitic god Moloch, and the punishments for violating this ban from Leviticus chapter 18, verse 21, and chapter 20, verses 2 to 5. Researchers also found a small scroll that preserves one of the earliest known copies of the Ten Commandments from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 20. It is also written in Hebrew and is dated from 30 to 1 BC. One of the best preserved biblical scrolls contains 48 Psalms from the book of Psalms, including 7 that are not found in the standard Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible. It also contains an epilogue which attributes 4,050 songs to David, affirming traditions regarding his authorship of many of the Psalms collected as scripture. This book is written in Hebrew and dated from 1 to 68 AD. The famous Great Isaiah Scroll is the best preserved of all the biblical scrolls. All 66 chapters of the biblical book are preserved. It is written in Hebrew and dated from 150 to 100 BC. As we mentioned above, the Dead Sea Scrolls collection also include fragments from works not included in the original Hebrew canon. For example, a fragment from the Book of Enoch has been found. This work purports to tell the story of Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, who, according to the Bible, lived 365 years, walked with God, and then was not. The displayed fragment recounts a heavenly revolt of fallen angels and their descent to earth to live among the daughters of men, to reveal great secrets of knowledge to humankind. And this interprets a biblical passage found in Genesis 6, 1 to 4. The scroll is written in Aramaic and is dated sometime between 150 and 50 BC. A scroll described as the Aramaic Apocryphon of Daniel describes either a messianic figure or a boastful ruler that will arise as Son of God or Son of the Most High. It's also written in Aramaic and is dated again between 50 and 1 BC. In addition to biblically related texts, several other interesting scrolls have been discovered. Perhaps the most unusual find is the copper scroll, literally written on copper, dated between 50 and 100 AD. It contains a list of locations at which various items of gold and silver are supposedly buried or hidden. But alas, no such treasure has been found. The community rule contains laws and rules meant for members of a group called the Yahad, or community. These rules provide insight into the religious and social lives of this group. The selected text on this image describes the leadership structure within this priestly society. It's written in Hebrew and is dated between 50 and 25 BC. Apocalyptic themes are found in the scroll called the Book of War. It describes an epic 40-year battle between good and evil. The fragment shown on the slide preserves a blessing that the leader pronounces upon the surviving community after their victory in the final battle. The leader affirms, God Most High will bless you and shine his face upon you, and he will open for you his rich storehouse in the heavens. God and his holy angels will grant abundance and fertility upon his holy congregation and protect them from plagues and wild animals. In addition to scrolls, researchers have found teflon or phylacteries in the Qumran caves. They're among the earliest known examples of these ritual objects, leather capsules containing scrolls with excerpts of biblical texts. They're written in Hebrew and date from around 200 BC to 50 AD. Evidence from a later period has also been found in the caves. Silver coins, personal and legal records, and even a sandal survive from the Bar Kokhba revolt, which took place between 132 and 135 AD. This indicates that the caves were still used as a safe storage area after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. We have, of course, just touched the surface of the vast treasury of documents and artifacts that these caves have provided. But at this point, we should pause and address the larger significance of these finds as they relate to both the history of Judaism and biblical study. What then do these important scrolls tell us about the development of Scripture and the culture in which the New Testament was written? Well, first, they substantially support our confidence in the text that we now know as the Hebrew Scriptures. They provide our oldest surviving Hebrew manuscripts of these scriptures, created sometime between 250 BC and 68 AD. Researchers have uncovered portions of every biblical work in the accepted Hebrew canon, except for the Book of Esther. These manuscripts were therefore written some 1,000 years earlier than previously known documents. As we mentioned in our last session, before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, our texts for the Hebrew Scriptures were based largely on the medieval Masoretic texts completed between the 6th and 10th centuries AD. By comparing these two textual traditions, researchers can determine how consistent the text remained over the centuries between them. And it turns out that the text has been preserved remarkably well. Many estimate that the large majority of the text, between 85% and 95% of it, has in fact remained remarkably consistent for almost 1,000 years. How extraordinary! God must have been at work in this process. Second, while not detracting from the remarkable consistency of these two traditions, textual variants do force us to acknowledge a dynamic and imperfect process of transmitting the whole of scriptures to succeeding generations. These variances remind us to tread carefully when we seek to determine what God has originally said. While the early transmitters of the Hebrew Scriptures pursued their task carefully and reverently, they were not perfect. Third, as we mentioned in our last session, several of the so-called deuterocanonical or apocryphal works are also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Manuscripts of the works known as Tobit, Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, and the Epistle of Jeremiah have all been identified. The presence of these works in both the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls indicate that these works were circulated and highly regarded throughout the empire in Jewish communities both within and scattered beyond Judea. Fourth, these scrolls demonstrate early methods of Jewish scriptural interpretation. They include pesharim, or commentaries that apply prophetic text to contemporary events. These commentaries reveal a diversity within early Jewish interpretations of scriptures. In contrast with more traditional views, for example, the Qumran community emphasized strong eschatological views regarding the coming Messiah and his reign on earth, with a requirement for strict adherence to Jewish law for those who wish to participate in his reign. And fifth, given this additional window into Jewish interpretation of the scriptures, these scrolls provide important cultural perspectives for New Testament interpretation. The divergent views found in Qumran paint an interesting cultural background when considering New Testament references to topics like Jewish law and messianic expectation. In summary, then, the Dead Sea Scrolls have significantly raised our overall level of biblical understanding and interpretation by providing a solid factual basis for our assumptions regarding the formation of the biblical text. We can strike a better balance between certainty and caution. Certainty because so much of the text seems to have been passed on so faithfully for some 1,000 years of biblical history. But also caution because everywhere we see human engagement in the process which is never fully perfect. We rejoice that the oracles of God revealed through his prophets have been passed on to us, but we must acknowledge that we do not have them in their pure original form. And for some reason, God wanted it that way. So what's the point? I believe it is simply this, that the Dead Sea Scrolls increase our confidence that the text of the Hebrew Scriptures has been well preserved through the centuries, and they provide important information about the culture in which the New Testament was written. When we consider their evidence, along with the evidence of the Septuagint that we discussed in our last session, we find ourselves in a blessed position. Confident in our sovereign God who preserved his word through time, but also cautious, realizing that there are many details that we do not know. Apparently, our Heavenly Father has determined that our humility may be as valuable as our certainty. And perhaps we are best served not to argue with him on that point. Be sure to return next week for our last session when we take a deeper look at the last 100 years before Jesus. But until then, I pray that God's Spirit will use this study to grow your walk with him. And don't forget, I'll see you on Sunday.